And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Molly Ball, national political correspondent for Time. Molly will be speaking with the founder of Fair Fight Action, Stacey Abrams, about her work on voting rights in the midst of the pandemic, the upcoming elections, and more. Molly?
Thank you, Edward. I am so pleased to be joined today by Stacey Abrams, who, in addition to being founder of Fair Fight and Fair Count, is the former Democratic leader of the Georgia State House and former Democratic gubernatorial nominee. Leader Abrams, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So so where is here for you? Where are you right now?
I'm in the dining room / studio of my townhouse in Georgia.
And I know from our interviews that you're a woman of many interests, from Star Trek to car racing. Have you picked up any new hobbies, started any new projects during your time indoors?
Well, I finished a book, so that's a good thing. Although, I'm looking forward to reading the one that's right behind you. And absolutely. No, I've got a stack of reading I want to get to, but other than that, just continuing to catch up on TV and do some deep reading and write when I can.
Yeah. Well, so let's turn to some local news out of Georgia. I want to talk to you about Ahmaud Arbery. You previously called his death a murder. It seems that it's now actually being prosecuted as such. How do you rate the state's handling of the case?
I begin by saying that it's a travesty that it took 74 days to get attention brought to his murder. And that meant that a group of us had to elevate it to national attention in order to secure even local reaction. But I think what's happened since, the willingness of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to step in and to do what the DA in Glenn County refused to do, as well as one of her colleagues down in South Georgia, and more importantly, the attention that's being given to ensuring not only that the case is adjudicated appropriately, but also that we take legislative action to respond to what put him in jeopardy in the first place. It's hate crimes legislation, which will address the penalty of the crime that was committed, but we also need to look at stand your ground laws, citizens arrest, and the criminalization of young black men and black people in the state of Georgia and around the country. And so we're working very hard with a coalition of organizations and the Arbery family to ensure that his death is not in vain and that the justice that they seek is actually accrued not simply through the prosecution of his murderers, but through changing the laws that made his murder possible.
And how about the governor's handling of the case? Do you think he's done the right thing here?
Once he became engaged, I think that the speed with which reaction and action is taken is important, but I can't divorce that from the fact that he's also pushing legislation in the General Assembly that will recriminalize juveniles and once again create the atmosphere in Georgia that we should pursue prosecution of young people instead of trying to make sure that we're doing the education and intervention that can make certain that they are taken care of, but also reshaping the narrative in Georgia so that black men aren't seen as dangerous, they're seen as human and as citizens.
How about the governor's handling of the coronavirus? He's come under a lot of criticism for his aggressive reopening timeline. What would you have done differently?
Well, I spent the last few weeks talking about what should have been, what should have happened, in part because what he did was not based on facts. It wasn't based on science. And unfortunately, what we have discovered has continued is a misuse, if not misappropriation of data. Number one, Georgia should have much earlier gone into shelter in place. That we were one of the last states to take that action. We're one of the largest states in the nation. And that meant you had a hodgepodge of reactions and solutions that were being put in place by county officials and mayors. We then became one of the first states to come out of shelter in place, despite the fact that our numbers were continuing to rise and without clear direction to owners of small businesses about what could be done. And unfortunately, in the state of Georgia, we know that the low-income workers who were compelled to go back to work did not have the option of saying no, despite the propaganda, because we're a right-to-work state. If a boss tells you to come to work and you refuse, they have the right to terminate you. And so we found the most vulnerable workers being put on the front lines without the protections. And we're in a state where we do not have Medicaid expansion. And so they not only risk their lives, their livelihoods, they risk their lives without necessarily knowing that there would be a benefit and the opportunity to get help. But the last piece, and the part that's the most disturbing, is the fact that we have watched in recent days a manipulation of data that pretends that Georgia is doing better than it is. This is a state where more than half of the deaths from COVID-19 are happening among African Americans. We're 34% of the cases, and we're only 32% of the population. There has not been enough attention, and there certainly hasn't been enough effort on the part of the governor to protect the state of Georgia, especially those who are the most vulnerable and the least resilient to this disease.
So what do you think is the way to move forward from here?
I think it's too late now to unring the bell he's rung, but what will have to happen is that we are prepared for the next wave of COVID, which is absolutely going to come. We know from the science, we know from the numbers that Georgia is going to experience another wave. And when that happens, we have to move quickly to shelter in place where we can, to get testing out, but also to make sure our contact tracing is more appropriately leveled up, and that we have access to the medical facilities that we need. Georgia is one of the states that refuses to expand Medicaid, which means we have a shortage of doctors and nurses. And we know that one of the symptoms of COVID-19 and one of the aftermaths is that people don't simply recover. They're left with up to 30% less lung capacity, which means you have semi-disabled people now who are part of what's left in the wake of COVID-19. We do not have a plan of action for how we're going to address the healthcare needs. In fact, to the contrary, the governor has proposed a massive cut to Medicaid in the state of Georgia as part of his budget. And so we need to make certain that when COVID hits again, that we are prepared to serve the people who need it, and that we do not falsely jumpstart our economy at the expense of our people.
I want to talk about your organization, Fair Fight, which you founded to fight threats to voting rights. Has the pandemic totally upended that mission? Has it changed everything? What has or hasn't changed about your work in that regard?
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, we anticipated there would be something catastrophic that happened in the 2020 election. I did not anticipate it would be a pandemic that shut down the world, but we knew that in the United States there would be some action taken, likely by the purveyors of voter suppression, that would push us into an unprecedented posture. And it happened. But luckily, because of our structure, we were ready to meet the challenge. We launched Fair Fight 2020 in 2019 so we could be in place in every state where we're operating by their presidential primary. Because we have been able to do so, we've been able to react moment to moment, and we've been able to shift our strategies. Where we were initially focusing on building the infrastructure for examining and responding to voter suppression tactics in each state, we now have a unified mission of trying to ensure that vote by mail is available to every eligible American in this country. If we can get vote by mail, if we can remove the barriers, if we can increase access, then what we can do is actually thin out the lines so that those who need to vote in person are the only ones who show up. We should all look at what happened in Wisconsin as both a travesty and a tragedy, but it's also a cautionary tale. We have the capacity to solve for that, to make certain that people don't contract the disease trying to exercise their most fundamental right, which is the right to vote. And because we were in place in Wisconsin, we were able to help deploy volunteers to answer phone calls, to help voters understand what was at stake. We were able to help the state party respond to the whiplash of decisions that were coming out of the state and out of the Supreme Court. But we were also able to help them prepare for what's next. And we're doing that in 18 states, covering more than 100 million voters. That means that we are on the ground doing the work now, preparing for 2020. And in light of the recent revelations that Republicans are planning to deploy 50,000 poll observers to intimidate voters. They're planning to build a $60 million war chest to beat back against expansion of the right to vote, and that they're creating this false narrative of voter fraud in order to scare people out of using their fundamental rights as Americans. We are ready to meet that challenge, and luckily we were built for this fight.
Is there any way in which the current state of affairs has actually shed a light on this, or even jump-started some of these reforms by focusing people on the need for ballot access for people who can't get to the polls?
Absolutely. Part of voter suppression's effectiveness is the fact that you have these labyrinthine rules that differ from state to state. It was only because of Wisconsin that people realized that vote by mail is not accessible in every state. There are 39 states that have no excuses absentee balloting, but in the remaining states, those are hurdles for people who need to be able to vote. And in Wisconsin, people finally realized that just because you have it where you live doesn't mean everyone does. Number two, we were able to uncover for the general public some of the challenges like signature mismatch laws. This is essentially a law that says that your signature has to look the same when you sign the back of your absentee ballot as it did the last time you signed a piece of paper, which could have been 10, 20 years ago. And that forensic notion, that forensic countermeasure against voter misinformation is actually flawed. It's junk science, but now people know that they have this challenge they weren't aware of. We have 10 states that require that you have a witness or a notary. And I dare anyone to find a notary public right now to validate the back of their ballot. And so while we have been raising the issue of voter suppression for months, in fact, for the last year and a half, what this has put into sharp relief is just how hard it can be for the average person to cast a ballot in ways that most people do not understand unless they try to use a different system than the one they're used to.
Well, and you were obviously partly inspired by what you went through in Georgia, and Georgia still has a primary coming up, if I'm not mistaken. How is that looking? How's Georgia doing on this?
Georgia's doing pretty good. We have, we were able to reach a bipartisan agreement with the Secretary of State to send out 6.9 million absentee ballot applications to active voters. Of course, the flaw in that is that did not go to new registrants, and it did not go to anyone who was considered inactive because they've missed recent elections. But the important piece is that it shows that this is a bipartisan opportunity. We also identified some challenges. One is that Georgia does not send a stamp. So when you try to return your application or return your ballot, you've got to find a post office that's open or a grocery store that's selling stamps. And that's difficult, especially in rural communities or in low-income communities. And so Georgia has done a better job than a number of states, but we still have some challenges we need to meet. Luckily, we've been able to either work it out by negotiation or by litigation, but we're making progress. We have had more than 1.5 million Georgians actually apply for those absentee ballots. And early voting started yesterday, which is another gold standard. We want not only for people to be able to vote by mail, but people who need to be able to vote in person should be able to. And in Georgia, in every county, you have to have early voting. And those early voting locations allow people who don't have options to cast their ballots. And by the time we get to Election Day, those who need to vote in person, those who are homeless, those who have been displaced, those who are disabled, those who have language barriers, or those for whom voting by mail simply didn't work, they'll be able to safely access the ballot and safely access the voting location so they can cast their votes.
Well, of course, none of us know exactly what things are going to look like with regard to the virus when we get to November. Last week in this venue, Jared Kushner told my colleague Brian Bennett that he wasn't sure he could commit to holding the election on November 3rd.
Is there any scenario, including a second outbreak in the fall, where the elections move past November 3rd?
That's too far in the future to tell. Nothing that I'm aware of now, but again, our focus right now is just on getting the country.
Will you commit that the elections will happen on November 3rd?
It's not my decision to make, so I'm not sure I can commit one way or the other.
Can you foresee any situation where it might be prudent to move the election date?
No. There's not only constitutional hurdles to change the election date, there are also legislative hurdles, and I'm fairly certain that we will not find common agreement between the House and the Senate on changing the election date. And so we have to prepare for November 3rd to be the date of the election. But what that means is that we have to understand the bureaucracy that goes into holding an election. One of the challenges facing Wisconsin, facing Georgia, facing Ohio, was that they had to shift how people access their ballots. And because of that, the sheer scale of provision of absentee ballots is going to tax the resources of states through no fault of their own. That means that the federal government, through the HEROES Act, has to act quickly to get the resources to states. And my hope is that Jared Kushner and others will focus on making certain that our democracy functions in November, as opposed to creating some mythology that it can change. The last thing I'll say is that the nation of South Korea experienced their first moments of COVID-19 at the same time as the United States. And on April 15th, President Moon oversaw a nationwide election, which had the highest voter turnout in 30 years. If South Korea can do that, the United States can. And South Korea had very little time to prepare. We've got 6 months. We know when the election is. We know it has to happen. What we're missing is the commitment of the U.S. Senate to invest in our states and to ensure that our democracy continues to function.
So about that presidential election, you have not been coy about your interest in being considered for the Democratic ticket. And some people have called that a little bit presumptuous. How do you respond to that?
I have been answering the same question for 14 months. It started in March of 2019, and if you track every single response I've given, it has always been the same. I recognize that it is, now that we have a nominee, it is Vice President Biden's absolute decision who he chooses to as his partner. He alone knows what he's looking for, and he has a smart team that will help him make the best choice. What I've responded to has been the question of whether I believe I should stand for it if I'm invited, and whether I can. And as a woman of color, I think about the women who are looking at me, the young women of color, those who've been told to hide their interest and pretend through coyness that they don't have ambition. My ambition is to serve. I live in a state where people are dying because of failed leadership. I live in a nation where we have an opportunity to either recover from this tragedy or to continue to sink into a malaise, and I want us to do better. I believe that Joe Biden is the right person for this moment. I believe his empathy, his competence, and his leadership is what we need. And I encourage anyone who wants to see this country be stronger to get behind his candidacy. My question is always, the question I get is, would I be willing to help? My answer is absolutely yes. And it's going to be my commitment, regardless of the decision of the Biden campaign, that I'm going to do everything in my power to make certain he's the next president of the United States.
Do you think that a man would be criticized in the same way for being open about his ambition?
No.
Biden has called himself a transitional figure. Do you think that heightens the stakes for whoever he chooses to be his partner on the ticket?
On day one, Joe Biden will be the president of the United States. We are electing our leader, and his leadership is what we should be looking to and what we should be thinking about. There is no shortage of qualified people who can serve as his lieutenant, and that should be absolutely his decision, because he's the only person in this conversation who's done that job. And so I trust that he's going to pick the right person for him, but we should not elide the notion that he is going to be the person who holds that office on day one, and everything we do should be about making certain that he has the capacity and has the support from our country to make him the next president of the United States.
You and many other Democrats have said you believe Joe Biden when he denies sexually assaulting Tara Reade. What message do you think it sends to survivors of sexual abuse when a powerful man's friends all gather around and defend him from an accusation like that?
I would start with the premise that we need to understand that survivor justice should be separated from any questions of politics. Women deserve to be heard. They deserve to have their allegations investigated. Survivors deserve a process that doesn't rely on politics or the press to adjudicate the legitimacy of their claims or their need for actual due process. That said, I believe Joe Biden because I know him, and because I, having read and understood the allegations, do not find them to be credible. They did not change my opinion of him, and I support him. But as he has said, he directly addressed these issues. He has directly addressed the question. And as he said, if there is anyone who doesn't believe him, they should vote their conscience and vote their heart. I stand behind my decision, and I just stand behind it as someone who is an American, who has the responsibility to determine the kind of leadership I wish to see. And I trust Joe Biden. He is someone who has stood for women and stood with women, and I believe him on this issue.
Well, how about the conduct that he's admitted to, the unwanted touching that has made numerous women uncomfortable? Why isn't that an issue?
He apologized for that behavior, and he has promised to remedy it. And if you look at the last 12 months, there has not been a single accusation of that conduct. I don't think that, even if you listen to those who were concerned about it, there was never a question of whether he was sexually harassing, but it was uncomfortable and it was discomforting. He acknowledged that, and he promised better behavior. I believe that he has done what he said he would do. And that's one of the reasons I so strongly support his leadership for our country, because this is a man who knows how to take accountability. He knows how to take responsibility. He has directly addressed the challenges. And unlike the current president, he has not shied away from taking direct responsibility and responding to accusations. But more importantly, he has talked about creating a process so that no survivor of any type of assault would ever have to hide or be afraid to come forward.
There's a big debate among Democrats about what the winning message is in this election, particularly against Donald Trump, but also in general. What what do you think is the right message for both, winning swing voters and particularly for those marginalized voters that you've been so focused on activating? What do you think they need to hear?
This is an election about competence and about courage. Donald Trump is incompetent. He has mismanaged every major challenge this nation has faced in 4 years. But he's also a coward who has refused to take responsibility for his actions, for his inactions, and for his mistakes. But more than that, we are a nation that deserves to be seen in our full glory, meaning that every person is seen and valued. Every person has an opportunity for success. And for those who are facing the harshest effects of COVID-19, that is largely communities of color, largely poor communities, they need to know that the leader of this country sees them, trusts them, and wants them to be successful. That's why Joe Biden is the only person who's talking about how we address healthcare, how we address the fracturing of our economy, how we make certain that when we recover, we do it right. This is a man who has demonstrated the competence to recover from the kind of economic depression we're in right now, because he did it under President Obama. But he's also someone who understands the global health security challenges that we face, because COVID-19 is not going to suddenly disappear. And he was the person who helped spearhead the global health security system that Donald Trump dismantled. This is a man who is competent, and he's a man of courage. He admits mistakes. He talks about what can be done to remedy those mistakes. But more importantly, he has a vision for an America that is stronger than we are today. And that's the kind of leadership we need. That conversation has to be had at every level, and we cannot take any voters for granted. And I'm very excited that the president or the vice president and his team are talking about an expanded map, that we're not simply going to relitigate the 2016 election, but that we understand that we're also running the 2010 election, where we're going to make determinations about the next decade of leadership, the next decade of congressional leadership, as well as state and local leadership. He understands that we have to have the broadest vision for America, and he's willing to put his resources and his campaign behind it.
Are you willing to predict today that Joe Biden will or won't win Georgia?
He will win Georgia.
Wow. All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Leader Stacey Abrams, for joining us today.
Thank you, Molly, for having me.